Hi, everybody. We are at a really difficult time in our nation's history right now. We're seeing a lot of things happen across the country. The past few days have been really intense in Omaha. We're starting to see some of what we've been hearing about in other cities trickling into ours as well. I think it's a time of a lot of uncertainty and fear, and a time period where, especially with quarantine on top of everything else, a lot of us are feeling kind of isolated within this and helpless, I think. I know I have really been missing the sanctity of a social work class environment. That was a space where I too was able to receive benefit of being able to talk about and process some of these events in a classroom kind of environment. And I wanted to just make this video today to talk about a few of the things that I think we'd be talking about if we were gathering in person over this time period. In social work, we talk about micro social work and we talk about macro social work. Generally, macro social work is geared towards these bigger picture systems changes. If we're talking about a topic like racial injustice, that's certainly a topic where macro social work comes into play. And the reason for that is really at the heart of it, what a macro perspective calls on us to do is to look at these circumstances, to look at these situations that may seem isolated, that may seem like they came out of nowhere, and to understand the broader context and the broader social environment surrounding those situations. So a macro perspective is really just looking at a current circumstance from a broadened lens. It's zooming out. If you've heard that saying about not losing sight of the forest for the trees, it's the same thing. Looking at a situation from a macro perspective is how we are able to look at the forest in addition to seeing some of those trees that are most immediately in front of us. So when we look at a situation like this, racial injustice has been embedded within the DNA of this country. The United States was created through racial injustice. Slavery is how our economic systems were built. If you have read anything by Michelle Alexander, her book, The New Jim Crow, if you've watched the documentary 13th, you are likely very well aware of the fact that our criminal justice system evolved directly out of our systems of slavery as well. So this doesn't necessarily make it easier to look at what's happening now. However, it takes away a bit of the mystery. And something I would add to that also is that my belief is that what we're seeing is part of our evolutionary process out of these kinds of situations. So for centuries in this country, we lived in an environment where racial injustice was very prevalent, where Black people and other people of color and other marginalized populations were targeted, were attacked, were injured, were violated, were murdered. We have always, the genocide that was committed against indigenous populations when people first came over, when Europeans first came over to this country, we have always been seeing this. Like, this has always been what's happening in this country. This is something that we don't talk about in the United States. Certain pockets know. You may have taken certain college classes where that information is taught to you, but far and wide, that is not what is being taught to people. What's different now is that we're starting to see it and we're starting to talk about it on a bigger picture lens. We're starting to hear about this on a national level, not just the populations that have been marginalized and isolated knowing what's happening, and other populations within their own pockets of privilege having kind of no clue of what's going on. We're no longer in an environment where something like that can happen. And a lot of that is the result of technology, the internet in particular, and some of those advances that have been made over the last few decades. What that's really doing is it's creating this very catalytic environment, again, this very kind of explosive environment where we're being called on a national level, we as in the collective we, are being called to take a look at things that haven't been looked at before. This is true on an internal and an external level. We can't change what we don't see and what we don't acknowledge and what we don't understand. If I have some sort of subconscious habit pattern and I'm not looking at that habit pattern and I'm not critically thinking about it and I'm not unpacking it, I can't change it, right? I don't understand what's going on inside of me enough to be able to stop my automatic responses. So what's true for the micro is true for the macro as well. What's true for the individual is true for the collective as well. And that's a big part of what we're seeing right now, is that we as a society, we as a country have to get to the point where we see what's happening, where we understand what's happening, where we're no longer able to brush it off as like a few angry Black people who are stirring up this argument. We have to, as a nation, get to a point where we see that this is pervasive. It's not within the Black people, it's within the institutions, it's within our systems, it's within the very structures of society, because we have built a society on the backs of racial oppression. Sometimes when things look like they're getting worse, it's because we're seeing that transition into understanding and awareness. We're seeing that, I mean, it's similar to how sometimes we as an individual human person, sometimes we have to hit rock bottom with a certain behavior to change our minds and realize like, oh crap, this isn't working for me anymore. But we have to get to that rock bottom point to realize that that's essentially what's happening on a collective scale right now. It's a necessary stage in a way in order to get to the place where we as a society can look and see and understand racial oppression exists. We have to do more than put a Band-Aid over it in order to change what's going on. So it's the first thing that I want to get across to whoever chooses to watch this video is just that don't let the circumstances you're seeing leave you feeling hopeless. We have a lot to reckon with in this country. It's a lot easier for me on an individual level to hit rock bottom than it is for the millions of people living in this country to collectively hit rock bottom enough to make that shift together. Macro change, it takes a lot longer, right? Like for something to change on an environmental collective level, it takes a lot longer. Along those lines, something else I want to talk about is that change looks different. Change making looks different for every single person, and because it's such a complex, because racial injustice is such a complex, interconnected, interwoven system really that permeates so many different aspects of society. Law enforcement is one of them, but law enforcement is just one of them. Law enforcement didn't create racial injustice. Racial injustice began, and law enforcement, well, racial injustice was again embedded into the DNA of this country. Law enforcement evolved out of racial injustice. So another thing to think about as we're seeing increasing protests, as you might be seeing a lot of arguing on social media of people who are pro-protest and anti-protest, and yes, it's changing things, and no, it's changing nothing. One thing I think is really important to keep in mind is that because of how big the institutionalization of racial oppression is, there are a million different pathways that can be taken and that ultimately will need to be taken in order to shift it. And everybody's pathway looks different, and that's okay. There is an important space for the actions that are being taken right now, the immediate actions that are being taken right now. I also just want to put this out there for folks who are feeling like maybe protesting or maybe that sort of outburst energy isn't necessarily what they're feeling called to do, and yet they still want to do something. I would really encourage you to do some contemplation about what are the ways that racial injustice shows up in the worlds around you. You could think about, in terms of symptoms and root causes, what are some of the root causes of injustice? The media perpetuates racial injustice, subconscious bias. Again, our education systems, the way we talk to and interact with one another. Segregation, the segregation in our city and other cities perpetuates racial injustice. There are many, many, many ways and avenues that if we ultimately hope to see racial injustice be addressed on a widespread level, there are many routes we're going to have to take. And what that means for all of us as individuals is that we can find and align with the route that best fits where we're at and what we're feeling called to do. I also want to add that doing the internal work surrounding racism is probably some of the most important work we can do if we don't, especially when we don't hold those identities ourselves. So if you're a person who's looking to support some of these efforts as an ally, absolutely look for the ways that you can physically show up. What I would say though is that some of the most important work that you can do is to take a look inside and start seeing, how does racial injustice show up in my everyday environment? Not just when I hear about something horrific happening on the news, not just when something's happening in my city or my country. How does it happen every single day? And that is really an infinite route to unpack, because it shows up in our every single day. It shows up from professionalism standards. What are we teaching people is the right way to speak, to think, to dress, to style our hair? It shows up in those sorts of expectations. It shows up in ways that we, and I speak on this as a social worker, it often shows up in the ways that our roles call us to support systems, to support the ways that systems are processing and the ways that systems are functioning, as opposed to prioritizing the humans within those systems. That's a deeper question that I could do a whole other video on, and likely will at some point, but it's something to ask yourself. Of course, it shows up in our subconscious bias judgments too, right? There's a well-known TED Talk by Verna Myers, I believe her name is, where she talks about a way to address subconscious bias is to walk boldly towards it. She talks about her own experience of being in a plane and realizing that the pilot was a female, and then she has all of these kind of nervous thoughts about, like, oh crap, am I safe? Will I be safe? And she realized it was coming from a lens of bias within her. All of us have, if we have grown up watching the news, if we've grown up in this country, none of us get through without subconscious bias being seeped into our consciousness. None of us make it through the elementary school system or the high school system or just the socialization processes without being socialized to have those kinds of subconscious biases. All of us have them. Absolutely all of us have them. Very similar to what we talked about with the macro perspective, only when we take a look at them and seek to observe them and seek to understand them can we start to change them. So Verna Myers talks about boldly walking towards your biases as a way to address them. I echo that, because that is how we make changes. That is how we start to embody and internalize the changes that we're hoping to see. On an individual level and on a collective level, we have to see it in order to change it. We can't heal what we don't understand. And finally, the last thing I want to touch on today is the importance of self-care. Especially in a time like this, we have already had a heck of a few months in quarantine, in financial uncertainty, and the stress that's come with constant fear messaging surrounding the coronavirus. We've already as a society been at this kind of, like, I would say, like a breaking point almost in some ways, which again feeds into some of the actions that we're seeing happening now. We've already been there. It's really easy to get pushed over that ledge especially when our social environment starts to build up around us. In the helping profession, we often talk about this notion of you can't serve from an empty cup. You have to fill your cup up first before you can serve others. And yes, that's partially true. I mean, we can serve from an empty cup. We can't serve effectively from an empty cup. If you think about like a day when you were super exhausted, just totally wiped out, totally depleted, and you tried to show up and help somebody else or talk to somebody else or whatever, and maybe you were a little extra snippy or you just weren't fully present, that's an example of what it means to not be able to serve from an empty cup. It doesn't mean that it's physically impossible to serve from an empty cup. It just means that the type of service that you're going to be offering is not going to be as quality or as rich as it would be were you not so depleted. This is something that I've learned through personal experience over these last couple of years, is that when we invest in our self-care, when we invest in ourselves, when we meet our basic needs, yes, like caring for our physical body and giving our body the fuel that it needs in terms of rest, in terms of food, in terms of nurturing, and we're also doing things to feed our souls, when we're doing the things that bring us joy, that help us feel in flow, that are creative outlets for us, that's when we get to a point when our cup is overflowing. That's when we get to the point of feeling so nurtured that we're able to share that outward. So not only is self-care like necessary if we hope to help others, it's also one of the best ways. Investing in ourselves is one of the best ways that we can then ultimately invest back out into society and embody and help bring about the kind of changes that we truly want to see. So a few pieces of self-care that I would encourage you to think about or to just put on your radar. One of the first things is boundaries. This is something that I think we're just starting to talk about in a meaningful way as a society, at least in this country. Boundaries can look a lot of different ways. So there are physical boundaries. A physical boundary might be like, I'm not going to watch the news all day, or I'm going to watch a little bit of the news and then I'm going to turn the news off, a couple hours before bedtime or whatever, so I can wind down and take care of myself. Or physical boundary could be, I'm not going to talk to that person right now. I'm not in a place to see that person right now. I'm going to say no right now to those kinds of events or invitations or whatever. There are also emotional and energetic boundaries too that we can keep with ourselves. And those involve, what am I letting my thoughts do? Am I letting my thoughts just kind of run amok in my head and keep me wrapped up in all these stresses and worries and what ifs? Or am I doing something to help calm that down a little bit? Am I sitting in meditation if that's something you feel you can do? Even a guided meditation is a way to calm down our thoughts a little bit. Am I taking a salt bath? Is that something that would help me release some of that mental activity so I'm not staying trapped in my anxiety so much, which is incredibly, incredibly depleting? Energetic boundaries are, what am I directing my energy towards? What am I directing my energy into? Am I scrolling through Facebook and ruminating on these really awful events and feeling just really terrible about all of that? Or am I incorporating ways of, again, feeding my soul while also not denying the realities that exist? Am I doing an art project? Am I writing a poem? Am I doing something to energetically express what I'm feeling without feeding into the energy of the things that I don't want to feel? Anxiety, stress, overwhelm. It's really, really, really easy in these times to become overwhelmed and just sort of shut down. Self-care and those types of boundaries are what we can use to keep afloat in these really difficult circumstances. Emotional processing, of course, is another aspect of self-care that is so deeply important at a time like this. Emotional processing can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes maybe people feel a sense of emotional processing from being able to attend things like protests. Maybe you feel that from being able to talk to a friend who you really trust and feel open with. Maybe you feel that from finding community and space that feels safe in social media environments. Maybe for you it's just listening to music. Maybe it's journaling. It could look a lot of different ways. The important thing is again, to not stay trapped and feeling helpless and overwhelmed. Find a way of putting words or putting some form of expression into what you're feeling. So important. One thing that the field of neuroscience has really taught us is that emotions and traumas, they live in the body and they stay stored in the body unless and until we do something with them. So again, that could be physical movement, it could be exercise if that's something you're into, could be yoga, could be meditation, but something to do something with whatever you're feeling is so important. When we suffocate those things, when we suffocate our emotions, that's what contributes to mental health symptomology. That's what contributes to anxiety, depression, all of those things. And finally, one thing that I feel like we really need at this point in time is permission to be where we're at. And that may be a wide range of feelings, emotions. Maybe you are incredibly angry and you're feeling a lot of anger and rage lately. Maybe you are sad and feeling a sense of depression and despair. Maybe you're feeling a little debilitated and as though you're not really able to give or contribute anything right now. Maybe you have a lot of energy and you want to do and contribute a lot. All of these things are okay. There's no wrong way to cope in a situation like this. It's very similar to grief. Grief is going to look different for all of us. And the most important thing is that we are giving ourselves the permission to be wherever it is that we are, that we're meeting ourselves where we're at. So if you are struggling with a lot of heavy emotions and depression and struggling to feel motivated to do anything, giving yourself permission to just rest and not do, I mean, sometimes we don't have a choice about the things that we have to do, but giving ourselves permission to rest as much as possible and not do the things that we don't have to do right now is a beautiful way to gift ourselves self-care. It's what allows us to re-energize so that we can come back in a few days not so depleted. If you're feeling a lot of energy, if you're feeling like you have to get some of that out, again, looking for those outlets of how can you do that. I think something coming up for a lot of folks, especially those who are showing up into these spaces as more allies, is a sense of guilt or a sense of shame over I didn't know this before, or I haven't done enough, or most of my life I wasn't aware, or maybe historically I perpetuated and fed into some negative racial stereotypes that I now see are not okay. If you're experiencing some of those emotions, I would also encourage you to be really gentle with yourself, to be as okay with where you're at right now as you can, to recognize that it's a growth process. All of us were socialized to believe negative things about the world around us. All of us have been socialized to hold negative perceptions about the other, whoever the other might happen to be. If you're going through that, it's something that all of us experience, and it's a process to move out of. And so I always encourage people to be careful with feelings like guilt and shame, because we can't know what we don't know. The change happens when we know, when we realize what we don't know. And if you're watching this video, if you've made it this far, then that's at least where you're at. You're at the point where you have at least recognized that there are some really big issues here. So if you're feeling that sense of guilt and shame, I would again encourage you to do something with that, process that a little bit. Give yourself permission that that's where you're at. Give yourself permission that you don't have all the answers right now. How could any of us have all the answers right now? We're all on this growth track together. We're all learning and growing together as we go. And there's really no perfect way to respond in a situation like this, because a situation like this has never before presented itself in this particular way. So being very gentle with yourself, hugely, hugely important way to practice self-care. I am sending so much love to all of you. This is a really tough time. This is a really scary time. This is a really tragic time. We're all in this together. Don't give up. Don't lose hope. There's so much hope to be had. It can be difficult to see it when we're stuck in the trees, but there's so much hope that will keep us going through this. And regardless of where this leads or how long some of these issues last, know that we are on a much larger macro trajectory of addressing these kinds of issues. Know that we are moving in the direction of progress. Progress isn't linear. Healing isn't linear. We will all move through this together. Stay with your loved ones. Stay connected to the people that you care about and that care about you. And yeah, stay tuned. Lots of love to all of you.